The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union crumbled, and the West declared, "We won." America flooded the streets with confetti. The Cold War was over. Democracy and capitalism had defeated communism, without firing a single direct shot. But here's what they didn't tell you. Today, Russia is still flexing its power. China, once overlooked, is now a global superpower. And America? Struggling with political division, economic anxiety, and fading global dominance. So, did we really win? Or did we just get comfortable while others got smarter? Because the Cold War wasn't just about bombs or borders. It was about beliefs. It was a war of systems. And some of those systems are still fighting today. We thought the Cold War ended in 1991. But what if that was just halftime? In this video, we're digging beneath the victory speeches and history books to uncover who really walked away with the win, and why that answer might not be what you expect. Part 1. What the Cold War really was. To understand who really won the Cold War, we need to first understand what it was. Because this wasn't your typical war. There were no front lines, no clear battles, no final treaty signed on a battleship deck. Instead, it was a global chess match, played in shadows, waged through ideologies, fueled by fear. After World War II, two superpowers emerged from the rubble. The United States, wealthy, democratic, driven by capitalism and individual liberty. The Soviet Union, scarred but standing, rooted in communism, promising equality through control. They were allies in war. But the moment the common enemy, Nazi Germany, fell, their differences turned into distrust. Their alliance shattered, and the world split in two. This was no mere competition for influence. This was a struggle over how the world should work. Would nations be free to choose their leaders and pursue personal wealth? Or would governments control production, education, and the flow of information in the name of equality? And the stakes? Nothing less than the soul of the modern world. But without open battle, how did they fight? Through proxy wars. In Korea, millions died while superpowers pulled the strings. In Vietnam, one ideology bled while the other supplied weapons and whispers. In Afghanistan, the US funded rebels to drain the Soviet military, while civilians paid the price. Through espionage, spy versus spy, double agents, stolen secrets, briefcases filled with lies. Through technology, the nuclear arms race meant both sides built enough firepower to end the world many times over. Satellites, rockets, the race to the moon wasn't just about science. It was a battle for dominance. Through culture, the Olympics, Hollywood versus Soviet cinema, even jazz and ballet were turned into tools of soft power. The Cold War was fought in classrooms, space stations, embassies, underground bunkers, and most of all, it was fought in people's minds. And yet, no official war was declared. No peace was ever signed. Just a long, chilling silence, haunted by the constant possibility of nuclear Armageddon. So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many believed the war had ended. That freedom had triumphed. That history had finally chosen a side. But the Cold War wasn't just a moment in time. It was a mirror. And what it reflected was the deepest hopes and the darkest fears of the modern world. So before we declare a winner, we have to ask, did the Cold War ever really end? Part 2. The victory that came with a price. In 1991, the world watched a flag come down over the Kremlin and believed they were witnessing the end of an era. America had won. Communism had failed. Freedom had prevailed. The Cold War was over. And the US stood alone at the top of the global pyramid. But here's the thing about winning a war. No one really understood. You don't always know what you've inherited. Because with victory came new responsibilities and new illusions. America didn't just defeat an enemy. It became the global manager, the world's policeman, the keeper of a fragile, rapidly globalizing system. NATO expanded. The US opened its arms and its markets to former Soviet republics. Globalization was sold as the next revolution. Cheap goods, free trade, borderless capitalism. And for a while, it worked. The 1990s brought a tech boom, cheap energy, and a sense of unstoppable progress. But underneath the celebration, cracks were forming. Jobs didn't go to war. They went overseas, to factories in far-off countries, where labor was cheap and unions were non-existent. American towns hollowed out. Main streets shuttered. Pride turned to resentment. America had defeated communism abroad, but forgot to protect capitalism at home. And as financial markets soared, wages stagnated, inequality deepened, and entire communities were left behind. The Cold War had promised a better future, but for many Americans, that future never arrived. Meanwhile, the US military didn't stand down. It stood taller. It stretched across the globe, peacekeeping in the Balkans, bombing in Iraq, intervening in Somalia, occupying Afghanistan bases in over 70 countries, trillions in defense spending, and a growing sense of moral duty to spread democracy. With no rival left, America believed its model was the default, that liberal democracy would spread on its own, that history had reached its final chapter. But history doesn't work like that. While the US basked in victory, other nations, humiliated, overlooked, underestimated, began to regroup. Because here's what the textbooks rarely mention. Sometimes the price of victory is complacency. And when you're the only one on top, everyone else starts studying how you got there. Some to copy it, others to tear it down. So while America was exporting democracy, two former Cold War rivals were doing something else entirely. They were watching, they were learning, they were waiting. They weren't planning to play the same game. They were preparing for the next round. Part 3. Russia never really left. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the world thought Russia had fallen, permanently. The hammer and sickle was lowered. A new Russian flag was raised. And to many in the West, it felt like the end credits of a war movie. But to the people inside Russia, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a free fall. The 1990s were chaos. The economy collapsed. Rubles became worthless. Lines for bread reappeared. And for the first time in decades, the Russian people looked around and saw something they hadn't expected. Humiliation. Once a global superpower, they were now being rescued by foreign aid. Western consultants arrived, promising democracy and free markets. But what followed wasn't freedom. It was a fire sale. State-owned industries, oil, gas, steel, were sold for fractions of their value. A handful of men, later known as oligarchs, became billionaires overnight. Ordinary Russians, they lost their savings, their jobs, their dignity. Crime surged, life expectancy plummeted, and the idea of democracy became synonymous with despair. And in that despair, a seed was planted. A seed that would grow into a man named Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, cold, calculating, fluent in silence. He came to power in 1999, promising not freedom, but order, not Western ideals, but Russian strength. and the people listened. Because by then, they weren't looking for capitalism. They were looking for control, for dignity, for something to believe in again. Putin didn't offer a future. He offered revenge on the past. Putin had watched the West celebrate. He saw NATO expand to Russia's doorstep. He saw US-backed revolutions in former Soviet states. And he drew a very different conclusion from the Cold War's end. We didn't lose. We were betrayed. And under that belief, Russia didn't disappear. It transformed. Instead of trying to match America plane for plane or ship for ship, Russia turned to asymmetry, cyber warfare, interfering in elections, hacking infrastructure, spreading disinformation, energy leverage, dominating European gas supplies, weaponizing winter, mercenaries and shadow wars, from Syria to Africa, quiet but deadly. Narrative control, propaganda not just for Russians, but for us. Putin didn't want to rebuild the Soviet Union. He wanted something more flexible, an empire of influence, not territory. A Cold War 2.0 that the world wouldn't even recognize, until it was already happening. And now, Russia has invaded neighbors, wields power in the Middle East, and still commands one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals. On paper, it lost the Cold War. But in practice, it's playing a very long game. And the scariest part? It might be playing it better than most think. Part 4. China's playbook. Watch, wait, surge. While America and the Soviet Union battled for global dominance, China watched. Not as a superpower. Not yet. In the 1960s and 70s, China was recovering. From the Cultural Revolution, from famine, from isolation. At the time, it wasn't seen as a major player. It was a question mark. But behind the silence was strategy. Because China wasn't just watching the Cold War. It was studying it. And what it learned would change the world. China saw the Soviet Union collapse under the weight of overreach, state control, and ideological rigidity. It saw the US succeed, not just with bombs, but with markets, media, and money. So in 1978, under Deng Xiaoping, China made a radical decision. It opened its economy, but not its politics. It welcomed capitalism without democracy. It invited foreign companies in, but never let go of the steering wheel. Factories rose. Cities exploded into megacities. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. And while the West saw cheap labor and endless profits, China saw something else: leverage. With that leverage, China built massive infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Global surveillance systems and 5G networks. Strategic ports under the Belt and Road Initiative. A space program that rivals NASA. Near total control over rare earth minerals and global manufacturing supply chains. All while maintaining total control over speech, dissent, and public opinion. This wasn't Soviet-style communism. This was something new. Authoritarian capitalism. And it worked. Today, China is the second largest economy in the world, the largest exporter, the biggest holder of US debt, the fastest growing military power in the Indo-Pacific, and yet, it never fired a shot in the Cold War, never fought a proxy war, never collapsed. While America fought, China positioned. The US believed that as China became richer, it would become freer. That capitalism would naturally lead to democracy. But China had other plans. It used openness as a tool to gain investment, technology, and knowledge before quietly tightening its grip. And now the world sees the results. A surveillance state exported around the globe. internet censorship rivaling Orwell's darkest visions, a digital currency controlled by the state, a population conditioned to choose order over rights. This wasn't a Cold War win. This was a new game entirely, and China has been playing it from the long arc of history. So while the Soviet Union tried to outgun America and lost, China did something more dangerous. It outlasted the war, then quietly outgrew it. And now, it's not hiding in the shadows. It's standing face to face. And it's not asking to join the world order. It's ready to redefine it. Part 5. America's post-Cold War dilemma. In 1991, the United States emerged from the Cold War, not just as a victor, but as the only superpower left standing. No rival, no ideological threat, no battlefield left to conquer. It was the beginning of what some called the unipolar moment. A time when the world seemed to orbit around Washington, D.C., when American ideals, free markets, democracy, global cooperation felt not just powerful, but inevitable. But that moment didn't last, because winning the Cold War gave America enormous power, but not always clarity. And in that vacuum of certainty came contradiction. The US believed it had found the blueprint for global peace: expand NATO, promote free trade, export democracy. But what looked like strength often bred resentment. Former Soviet states were promised protection, but Russia saw encirclement. China was welcomed into the global economy and quickly used it to rise. American companies thrived abroad, while at home, workers lost jobs, lost identity, lost faith. The Cold War had ended, but the wounds it left behind, they didn't heal. They just changed form. In the name of security, the US expanded its global footprint. Bases in more than 70 countries, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, drone strikes, no-fly zones, endless deployments. For every threat extinguished, 3 more seemed to rise. America's military was unmatched, but its mission became unclear. Was it spreading freedom, protecting oil, fighting terrorism, or just trying to stay relevant in a changing world? And at home, another Cold War legacy was unraveling. The US had doubled down on global markets, on deregulation, on the belief that free enterprise would always self-correct. But instead, it led to a devastating financial collapse in 2008, soaring inequality, political polarization so deep, it threatens the foundation of democracy itself. While America had won, many of its citizens were asking, won what exactly? The Cold War had been framed as a battle of ideologies, democracy versus dictatorship, freedom versus control. But in the decades since, democracy in the US has grown fragile. Misinformation spreads faster than truth. Elections spark division. Trust in institutions is at an all-time low. And around the world, authoritarianism is rising. Not in opposition to America, but in response to its perceived decline. So here's the dilemma. America won the Cold War with vision, but it entered the post-Cold War world with assumptions that its dominance would go unchallenged, that its values would spread without resistance, that its victory was permanent. But history doesn't stay still, and power, without reflection, becomes a burden. So while America looked outward for threats, a deeper question was forming within. If you defeat your greatest enemy, but lose your own sense of purpose, did you really win? Part 6. The next Cold War? We called it a Cold War because the bombs never dropped. But just because something doesn't explode doesn't mean it's not burning. And now, as the 21st century unfolds, a chilling question returns. Are we already in another Cold War? And just don't realize it? This time, there are no Berlin walls, no nuclear standoffs in Cuba, no red telephone in the White House waiting to ring. But don't be fooled. The battlefield hasn't vanished. It's simply moved. From borders to bandwidth, from battlefields to cyberspace, from bombs to algorithms, from armies to influence. And the new superpowers? They're not just military giants. They're tech empires, data lords, and narrative architects. China and Russia aren't allies, but they're aligned in one critical belief. America's time is up, and they're no longer interested in catching up. They want to rewrite the rules. China builds digital Silk Roads across Africa and Latin America, while launching satellites and testing hypersonic weapons. Russia hacks elections, targets infrastructure, and spreads disinformation like wildfire. And together, they test the West's will, not with tanks, but with tactics. And where is America? Still powerful, still wealthy, still influential, but distracted, torn from within by political division, misinformation, a shrinking sense of shared identity. Because this new Cold War doesn't require invasion. It just needs confusion. It just needs doubt. If you can make a society question itself, you don't have to beat it. You can watch it crack from the inside. And the weapons of this new era, they don't explode. They infiltrate. TikTok scrolls shaping your worldview, satellites monitoring every move, deep fakes distorting truth. Supply chains weaponized, rare earth minerals traded like Cold War oil. AI systems trained with values you didn't choose. This isn't science fiction. This is strategy. And it's already happening. This Cold War doesn't need missiles. It needs moments of weakness. It feeds on economic shocks, social unrest, digital dependency. And if history teaches us anything, it's that Cold Wars don't stay cold forever. So, are we in a new Cold War? Maybe. Maybe not. But here's the better question. Are we ready for it? Because if the last Cold War was fought with bombs and ideology, this one will be fought with influence, intelligence, and intention. And if we don't learn from the last one, we won't just lose this one. We'll never even know it started. If this video gave you a new lens on history, if it made you think about what the Cold War really meant, then hit that subscribe button. Share it with someone who still thinks the Cold War is ancient history, because it never really ended. This is where history meets the present and quietly reveals the future.